Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How serious of a threat are nuclear weapons to people worldwide? What can be done to reduce the nuclear stockpile without endangering people's lives? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at the threat of nuclear weapons and what can be done to reduce the nuclear weapons stockpile. My guest is an expert on this topic. My guest today is Mr. Ward Wilson. Mr. Ward Wilson, an award-winning author of 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons, also directs the Rethinking Nuclear Weapons Project at the British American Security Information Council. Mr. Wilson has traveled quite a bit, over 250,000 miles, and spoken in 23 countries over the past 6 years or so. He's addressed groups at the Pentagon, the U.S. State Department, the United Nations, and parliaments in Great Britain, Norway, and many other areas. Ward Wilson, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being back with me. This is a very serious topic and one that we don't read as much about as we should, but we're going to talk about it today. Just how serious a threat is this looming potential nuclear weapon type of initiative that could take place?
Well, there's still 15,500 nuclear weapons in the world in 9 countries. More than half the world's population depends on the threat of nuclear war for its security, either directly or because they have allies that use nuclear deterrence. And if there were a nuclear war and all the nuclear weapons got used, it would probably mean at least 400 million people killed and civilization wrecked for centuries.
Exactly. I've seen statistics over the years. About 6 or 8 years ago, the experts who looked at the cost, not of building the weapons, but just maintaining them. It was running the United States alone. Now, that's not counting the other countries, the other 8 countries that have nuclear weapons. It's running about $100 million per day. Today it's about above $130 million. That is a huge amount of money that is not being invested in bridges, infrastructure development, education, health programs. Of course, people want to be safe, obviously, but is there some way to reduce that amount of money and to invest it in some of the more substantive projects other than nuclear weapons?
Well, it is a lot of money, and people have been talking about how much money we spend on nuclear weapons since Eisenhower's farewell speech in 1959, 60. I think what's exciting about today is that there is a credible, realistic case for eliminating nuclear weapons. In the past, people have talked about idealistic reasons for getting rid of nuclear weapons, but I think today you can build a case based on utility and risk that's persuasive.
Exactly. Well, Ward, you're a prolific author and you've written many books, and one of the most recent in 2013 deals with this. It's called 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons, and it is a very interesting title, very catchy title, a catchy cover of the book. Let's talk about those 5 myths very briefly. Just what is the first myth that we have to look at when we're talking about nuclear weapons?
There's a lot of misinformation about nuclear weapons. Most of what we think about them was developed during the Cold War when people were really afraid, and often people don't do their best thinking when they're afraid. First one is that the bomb forced Japan to surrender at the end of World War II. In fact, historians have looked at it recently and find that the Soviet Union's declaration of war, the Soviets had been neutral, on the same day we bombed Nagasaki, is what actually forced Japan to surrender. And this matters because a lot of what we think about nuclear weapons, we think they're kind of amazing and shocking and influential because of that first event.
That is interesting because we often hear that that's what brought the Japanese to the bargaining table, and that's what really ended World War II. What is your second myth about nuclear weapons?
Let's see. The second myth is that nuclear weapons win wars, that bigger is always better. And in fact, of course, nuclear weapons are tools. And anybody who uses tools knows that the biggest tool isn't always the best tool. If the best tool was always the biggest one, then you'd always use a sledgehammer for all your home repairs. So the fact is, nuclear weapons are too large really to be useful. They unintentionally kill lots of people when you use them, and they create radiation that can spread downwind for hundreds of miles. So they're clumsy weapons. We think they're awesome, but they're really too big for any realistic use.
And often, or from time to time, I should say, you hear members of Congress and other people say, well, we could have a limited nuclear interaction with whatever country might be, Russia or whomever it might be. But when you start using nuclear weapons, first off, the fallout is going to be so great. We hear about nuclear winter, how we can change the climate. But if you're exchanging nuclear weapons, who knows when to stop? And it seems to me like in that type of a situation, nobody's going to stop. Everybody is going to lose, no matter how limited it may be. But this is really irresponsible to talk, in my opinion. What do you think about that?
Well, it's exactly right. The problem with a weapon, you want to blow up a building in a city, and you could use a conventional bomb, but instead use a nuclear weapon, and you kill 60,000 people unintentionally as collateral damage. The problem is twofold. First problem is, as a leader of a country, if you have to consider that you might kill 80,000 people by accident with a weapon, you might hesitate to use that weapon. And in war, hesitation can be fatal. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, if you use a weapon that kills a lot of innocent civilians, the people on the other side will be more determined to resist, and they'll want revenge. And this is what you're talking about. You use a nuclear weapon, the other side wants revenge, they use a nuclear weapon back, now you've lost a lot of civilians, you want revenge, back and forth till they all get used. Almost everyone believes that even if you try to use a few nuclear weapons, it will escalate to all-out nuclear war. And all-out nuclear war is not an acceptable outcome.
And since we started developing nuclear weapons, I guess the original atomic bomb back in the mid-40s, first off, how many countries have nuclear weapons today?
9 countries. Don't ask me to name them.
That's all right.
U.S., Russia, China, France, Great Britain, Pakistan, India, North Korea, Israel.
You got them.
I always forget Israel. So, I'm sorry, now I got lost.
No, I was just asking, how many countries had nuclear weapons?
Right. Yeah. Nine countries have nuclear weapons, and the problem is that during the Cold War, the weapons were relatively aligned between two camps, but as time passes, more and more countries seem to be getting nuclear weapons or considering getting nuclear weapons. There's talk about the Saudis getting nuclear weapons from Pakistan. There's talk about people developing nuclear weapons secretly, Iran, Myanmar. So as the world becomes more multipolar, the problems of keeping conflicts contained become more complex, and the dangers increase.
As more and more players get more and more weapons, you have less control over what's happening. When you mentioned Iran a minute ago, and of course we saw several months ago really a striking agreement between Iran and 5 or 6 major powers at the United Nations, cracking a deal to reduce the possibility of the Iranians going nuclear as far as getting nuclear weapons. How significant was that agreement?
Well, I thought it was very significant. I think that it's the right thing to do. You have a chance to keep a country from having nuclear weapons for 15 years, and potentially much longer. And that's what the fewer countries that have nuclear weapons, the better, always, I think.
Exactly.
So some people complain about the terms. I it seems reasonable to me. I think it's worth doing.
Right, and as I understand it, the number one goal was to make sure they did not get the bomb. There were a lot of ancillary issues tied to the whole series of negotiations, but the goal was to make sure that didn't get the nuclear weapon. That's right. That's an important thing. What we've seen in the past too, there have been at least that I know of, or we can think of 2 or 3 countries that had the chance to go nuclear and did not. I think South Africa, Argentina, Libya was moving in that direction. They denuclearized. Why was that important for them to do that?
Well, a lot of people imagine that because nuclear weapons are big, they're necessarily very, very desirable. But as I've already said, bigger isn't necessarily better. And one of the things that's interesting about South Africa is, and Kazakhstan, for instance, and others, is that there are clear evidence that there are countries that could have built nuclear weapons that chose not to. A lot of people think that that's because, the U.S. put pressure on them or various other arguments. But there are at least a number of cases where it's very clear that they looked at the possibility of having the weapons, thought about how useful they might or might not be, and simply chose to spend their defense dollars elsewhere. And I think that that's an indication of the fact that the weapons aren't useful. On
infrastructure development, education, whatever it might be, health programs, whatever. Now, you have a very interesting website, rethinkingnuclearweapons.org, that our viewers can go to and get more information about what we're talking about today and what we may not get a chance to talk about. I think we got through 2 of the 5 myths. I got digressed into a few other areas. What's the third myth? I want to make sure we get all 5 in.
Okay, the third one is that deterrence works reliably, and people say deterrence has worked for 60 years and it's kept us safe. And I'm going to combine myths 3 and 4, because the 4th one is that we've been safe for 70 years. Problem with that is that deterrence does work some of the time. It encourages us, it dissuades us from doing stupid things. But against deterrence is the power of human folly. Human beings are fallible and we make mistakes. And so it's this constant balance between whether nuclear deterrence can keep us from doing what's foolish. I've read history, and I don't ever bet against human folly. If human beings have a chance to be foolish, eventually they will be. And so the result is that we can't rely on nuclear deterrence forever. Eventually it will fail. And if it does fail, then we run the risk of having this enormous war in which 400 million people are killed.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would encourage our viewers to go to the website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you have an interest, if you're involved in any type of media outlet, be it a PBS, community access television station, a college intra-campus television station, a website, whatever, and have an interest in the programs that are on globalconnectionstelevision.com, they are provided as a public service, free of charge, and we would encourage you to download them and share them with your community or anyone who has an interest. Today we're talking about a very serious and a very important issue, the threat of nuclear weapons. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Mr. Ward Wilson, and Ward Wilson is the author of 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons, and he also directs the Rethinking Nuclear Weapons project at the think tank BASIC. Ward, we were talking about deterrence a minute ago. Number 3, as I recall. I don't want to lose track of the numbers here. But you were talking about deterrence. And as you mentioned, to some degree, it indicates, or history indicates, that we have been able to deter one another for whatever reason. But also, have we not had situations where almost that deterrence, there were fallible mistakes that almost occurred? I know I've read that there were at least 12 times since 1945 that we could have had a nuclear exchange with the former Soviet Union or with someone else. That's very serious. And how can we safeguard from the outside of reducing? I mean, we want to reduce the nuclear stockpile, but that is really serious. That there could have been 12 exchanges that we know of. There may have been others.
There are foreign policy crises, and there are a series of technical accidents. And there's recently been a film, The Man Who Saved the World, about a Russian lieutenant colonel. One night he's on duty, and the alert goes up, and the computers all say there's a U.S. nuclear attack coming, and his job is to report it to headquarters, and then they'll launch the counterattack. He doesn't believe it, and he eventually says, no, we're not going to, I'm not going to pass on the message. And we don't have a nuclear war as a result. But human beings are fallible, and leaders are fallible, and frontline soldiers are fallible. Let me tell you the story about Cuban Missile Crisis just briefly.
Please, that was my next question.
All right. Height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Saturday, October 27, 1962. US U-2 flies over the North Pole on an air sampling mission and malfunctions, and flies back off course 300 miles inside the Soviet Union. Height of the crisis. Here's a US plane, they don't know if it's a bomber or what it is, wandering inside the Soviet Union. They scramble MiGs to shoot it down. We scramble F-102s to find it and protect it, except it's the height of the crisis. And so all of the conventional air-to-air missiles have been taken off the F-102s and been replaced with nuclear air-to-air missiles. The only weapons those fighters had as they roared towards Soviet airspace were nuclear weapons. Those two groups of fighters find each other and fight it out. There's a nuclear explosion over Russia and a nuclear war. They didn't find each other, but that's not because deterrence worked like magic. It's because we were lucky. So I think that historically the danger is eminently clear. And so we need to do something so that we don't have to rely on nuclear deterrence, on this threat of all-out war in order to be safe.
Exactly. And at some point, the luck may run out.
Absolutely.
And then we have a very serious problem. You were talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and as we read the history books, we come to find out that that situation had really ratcheted up to the point where we were just one button away. The red button was going to be pushed, and there would have been a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, which, had that been the case, we would not be here today. We would not even be around.
Absolutely.
But this is very, very serious. Well, we talked about, I think you merged myth 3 and 4,
Yes.
myths 3 and 4. What is myth number 5?
Myth 5 is that we have no alternative, that there's nothing that can be done, that a madman who cheats and builds a bomb can rule the world. And it's simply not so. You can't, even a madman with 50 nuclear weapons, if he built a nuclear arsenal, the first thing that would happen is that the US and Russia and China and Great Britain and France and Israel and Pakistan would all quickly rebuild their arsenals. And they would do it within 6 months. You can't conquer the world in 6 months. And then you just go back to the status quo ante. So this notion that what the argument that a madman with the bomb could rule the world really is it's a statement that nuclear weapons are magic weapons. If you had even just one, you could control everything. If you had a nuclear weapon, you could blow up one city. Would you blow up an American city, a Russian city, a Chinese city, an Indian? How would you know who to fight with your one weapon, or even 10 weapons? You know, the Japanese had 68 cities bombed in World War II, and they didn't surrender until the Soviets declared war. The Germans had even more cities bombed. If someone developed a nuclear weapon, everyone would immediately say, he's another Hitler, and they would do whatever they had to stop him.
Exactly. And we say now that there are 9 countries that we know of that have nuclear weapons, and they're responsible countries. So we're not quite as worried, even though accidents can happen. What about a group such as ISIS or some type of radical splinter group getting a suitcase bomb? Is that possible? They've not been able to do it at this point, but is the technology out there available? Is it such that at some point they might get it?
Well, I don't know, suitcase, but if you got a regular nuclear weapon, you can always put it in a van or on a truck, drive it downtown somewhere, put it in a shipping container and ship it on a freighter. I think that if you want to ensure that terrorists get a nuclear weapon, all you have to do is to continue the way we're going today. Because more and more weapons in more and more hands, there's just more and more chance that someone will eventually sell one to a terrorist or they'll steal one. The only way to make sure the terrorists never get their hands on a nuclear weapon is to get rid of all the nuclear weapons.
And I mentioned earlier you're a prolific author, and you're writing a book, The Realist Case for Eliminating Nuclear Weapons. How does that tie into your last statement? What is the realist view versus perhaps the ideal, or whatever the case might be, ideological maybe?
For years and years, the arguments against nuclear weapons were mostly idealistic arguments. People would say we have to get rid of them because they're immoral. It's absolutely true, they're immoral. But the realists would say morality, necessity trumps morality, which is a pretty compelling case. So the realist case for eliminating nuclear weapons argues that we should get rid of nuclear weapons not because they're wrong or they're bad, but because they're not very good weapons and the risks are greater than the advocates for nuclear weapons have said. It's a pragmatic case, and it's time that those arguments were put on the table and discussed.
For years, we've been hearing about the doomsday clock. That I guess a group of nuclear scientists many years ago came up with this idea, and it shows the hands of the clock. First of all, tell us a little bit about the doomsday clock and how close are we, and are we moving closer to the bewitching hour of 12 or midnight, whatever you want to call it?
Doomsday clock was set up by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, a publication from Chicago, founded by a group of nuclear physicists who worked on the original bomb. And the idea is to show how close we are to midnight. And for many years in this Cold War, it was very close to midnight. But in the 80s and 90s, the minute hand moved away from midnight because tensions relaxed and there were reductions in arsenals. But with the rise in extremism and anger and conflict and countries falling apart and difficulties in the world, it's now 3 minutes to midnight, which indicates that it's a very serious time, and that it's an issue that at least those physicists and the people who work in that organization believe it's quite serious.
Mm-hmm. You're also working on another book in between the first two that you started working on, called Hitler Gets the Bomb. Now, this is going to be a novel. What is the thrust of that book?
Well, it's a historical counterfactual where Hitler builds a nuclear weapon in 1943, and then they use them against Great Britain. This is kind of addressing the idea that a madman with the bomb could rule the world. In fact, what happens is they use the bomb 19 times against Great Britain. The U.S. shifts all its emphasis from the Pacific to Europe and concentrates on Europe so they can stop Hitler. 3/4 of the German units are fighting on the Eastern Front against the Russians anyway. And eventually the war ends pretty much right on schedule because nuclear weapons aren't very useful on the battlefield and the British refuse to give in. So it's actually quite difficult because I'm used to writing serious stuff, and I'm not that good at writing a novel yet, but I'm practicing. I hope to get better.
When you finish it, we'll have to come back and talk about it in greater detail. And of course, before we run out of time, let's talk about the verification issue. This is the bottom line. And a lot of people want to reduce the nuclear stockpiles. They believe it's very important, and that if you keep ratcheting up, an accident could happen. How can we verify? The United Nations could play a key role in this. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty could play a role in this. But how can we verify that country X is not going to reactivate their bomb program?
We're fortunate about nuclear weapons. They're made from uranium or plutonium. Both substances give off radiation. It's like a little signal that says there's some, radioactive material here. And so they're relatively easy to find. Traces of nuclear work remain. They're very hard to scrub away. They've been talking about doing inspections in Iran and testing the soil, and even after you try very hard to clean things up, if there's any soil left over with radiation, it's relatively easy to detect. So the good news is that if we decide that we want to, if we have the political will, we can verify nuclear weapons. It might be possible to build a few weapons in secret. Most of the experts I've talked to say that you couldn't build more than 50 without getting caught. And as I say, even if you cheat, all that happens is that everyone else quickly rebuilds their nuclear weapons, and you go back to the status quo. So I think every future has risks. The future with nuclear weapons has risks, and the future without nuclear weapons has risks. Just a question of balancing those risks. I think on balance, we're much safer if the possibility of 400 million plus people being killed is off the table.
Well, Ward Wilson, this is a very important topic. It's one that affects all 7.3 billion people on planet Earth. It's one that we need to learn a lot more about, and it's very expensive to maintain, not only to build them, but to also to maintain these nuclear weapons. And at some point, we have to come to the conclusion that we're better off to reduce the nuclear stockpile and to make the world a safer place, and to put that money into education programs, health programs, infrastructure development. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. It's
Thank
great.
you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.